Is this some kind of joke? The voice, sharp and laced with the condescending bite of youthful arrogance, cut through the humid afternoon air. Kyle Kramer, lead technician, 26 years old and top of his class, kicked the landing skid of the dormant helicopter. The thud of his boot against the olive-drab metal was a flat, unsatisfying sound. The machine, a relic from a bygone era, sat defiant and silent on the otherwise pristine tarmac of Fort Holloway. Around it, a team of a dozen technicians stood with their arms crossed, their faces a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. Laptops with diagnostic software lay open, their screens filled with green-lit system checks that all screamed the same lie. Everything was fine. Yet the UH-1 Huey, affectionately nicknamed the Patriot Bell, refused to start. Its rotor blades drooped in the heat like wilted leaves. A few yards away, an old woman stood alone, her presence a quiet rebuke to the frantic energy of the technicians. Alice Vance was thin, with a cloud of silver-gray hair and skin weathered by decades of sun and wind. She wore simple denim jeans and a faded olive-green jacket, the kind that had gone out of style before most of the people on the tarmac were born. She just watched, her hands tucked into her pockets, her gaze fixed not on the bustling technicians, but on the helicopter itself, as if listening for a secret it refused to share with anyone else. Lieutenant Wells, the officer overseeing the fiasco, strode over to the old woman. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid with the authority of his fresh-out-of-officer school rank. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked. The word "sir," a formality stripped of all respect. "This is a restricted area." Alice's eyes, a pale, clear brown, shifted from the helicopter to the lieutenant. They were calm, observant, and held a depth that made Wells feel strangely transparent. "General Michelson sent for me," Alice said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The name's Alice Vance." Kramer overheard and sauntered over, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Vance? You're the guy the General pulled out of retirement? We've got a dozen certified avionics specialists here, 3 master mechanics, and a direct line to the manufacturer's engineering department. What exactly do you think you're going to do?" Alice's gaze drifted back to the Huey. "Just look for now." "Look?" Kramer scoffed, throwing his rag onto a toolbox. "We've been looking for 6 hours. The digital multimeter shows perfect continuity. The fuel lines are clear. The ignition system is getting power. Every sensor is online. The computer says it should fly. It's this old bucket of bolts. It probably just decided to die." A few of the younger technicians snickered. Lieutenant Wells crossed his arms, mirroring Kramer's impatience. "Ms. Vance, we appreciate you coming down, but as you can see, we have the situation under control. My team is highly trained." "They're trained on glass cockpits and fly-by-wire systems," Alice said, her voice even. "This bird is different. She has a soul, and right now, her soul is quiet." Kramer let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A soul? Okay, Pop. You hear that, guys? We don't need a spectrum analyzer. We need an exorcist." The laughter from the crew was louder this time. Alice ignored them. She began a slow walk around the helicopter, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. She didn't touch anything, not yet. She just looked. She peered at the rotor mast, her calm brown eyes tracing lines no one else could see. She bent down to examine the tail boom, her expression unreadable. The technicians watched her with a kind of fascinated disdain, as if observing a curious ritual from a primitive tribe. "Her credentials," Wells muttered to Kramer, looking at a file on his tablet. "Says here she was a crew chief in Vietnam." He said the word Vietnam, as if it were ancient history, a chapter from a textbook. "A crew chief?" Kramer repeated, shaking his head. "So she knows how to patch bullet holes and swap out parts in a jungle." "We're not in a jungle, Lieutenant. We're on a modern military base with tools that cost more than his house." Alice stopped near the portside engine cowling. She was looking at a specific panel, a small, almost unnoticeable plate just below the main exhaust. She squinted, her head cocked. "What is it?" Wells asked, his tone heavy with theatrical patience. "See a ghost?" "Something like that," Alice murmured. She pointed a steady, wrinkled finger. "That access panel? Is it flush?" Kramer rolled his eyes and walked over, running his hand over the spot. "It's flush. The torque specs on those bolts are perfect. I checked them myself. The sensors behind it are all green." "Did you open it?" Alice asked. "There's no reason to open it," Kramer shot back, his frustration boiling over. "The diagnostics show no fault in that subsystem. Opening it would mean breaking a factory seal and generating a mountain of paperwork for a non-existent problem." He gestured expansively at his array of computers. "The system tells us where the problem is, and it's not there." "Your system," Alice said softly, "doesn't know this bird. I do." She reached into her old jacket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. It was scarred and stained, the leather softened by decades of use. The snap was polished smooth from the touch of her thumb. She fumbled with it for a moment, her old fingers not as nimble as they once were. Kramer smirked. "What's in there, Grandpa? A magic wand?" Alice didn't answer. She simply looked down at the pouch in her hands, and for a fleeting second, the noisy tarmac of Fort Holloway dissolved. The air was thick, wet, and smelled of rot and cordite. The deafening whump-whump of rotor blades battered her ears. She was 20 years old again, her knuckles bloody, sweat stinging her eyes. Tracers, green and terrifying, zipped through the triple canopy jungle below. Inside the vibrating belly of this very same Huey, a pilot was screaming on the radio. A co-pilot was slumped over the controls, and half a dozen grunts were praying. A round had punched through the engine cowling, and the bird was losing power. She'd crawled out onto the skid, the wind trying to tear her away. And from that very leather pouch, she'd pulled a roll of sealing tape and a stubby custom ground wrench. The pouch had been a gift from a pilot she'd saved the week before. She had braced herself against the fuselage and worked, her hands sure and steady while the world fell apart around him. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving the ghost of rotor wash in her ears. Alice looked up, her calm brown eyes refocused on the arrogant faces of Kramer and Lieutenant Wells. They saw an old woman with a shabby tool bag. She saw the ghosts of the young men she'd kept alive. The heat was becoming oppressive. The General's demonstration flight was supposed to have started an hour ago, with dignitaries waiting in a cooled viewing stand across the base. The delay was turning into a full-blown embarrassment. Lieutenant Wells's radio crackled. It was the base commander, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Status report, Lieutenant." "No change, Colonel," Wells said, struggling to keep his own voice steady. "We're still troubleshooting a no-start condition. The techs are running level 3 diagnostics now." "And the civilian? The one General Michelson insisted upon?" Wells glanced at Alice, who was still standing quietly by the engine. "He's here, sir. He's observing." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Put him on the phone with the General now." The order felt like a slap. Humiliated, Wells walked over to a young airman named Peterson. Peterson had been watching the entire exchange, not with the derision of the technicians, but with a quiet, troubled curiosity. He'd seen the way the old woman looked at the helicopter. It wasn't arrogance, it was a profound, unshakable familiarity. "Peterson," Wells snapped. "The Colonel wants the civilian on a secure line to General Michelson." "Yes, sir," Peterson said, grabbing a tactical phone. But as he approached Alice, he saw the contempt in the eyes of Kramer and the others. He remembered his own grandfather. Something clicked in his mind. He handed the phone to Alice, but then, on impulse, he stepped away and used his own personal cell phone. He scrolled through his contacts and found the number for the General's direct aide, a major he'd met during a briefing a month prior. "Major Davies," he said, his voice low and urgent, turning his back to the others. "Sir, this is Airman Peterson at the flight line at Fort Holloway. I'm sorry to call you directly, but sir, it's about Ms. Vance." "What about her?" the major asked, his tone immediately sharpening. "He's fine, sir, but the situation here is not good. The lead tech and the lieutenant are treating him like he's senile. They're laughing at her. They won't let her near the aircraft. They're relying on their computers. And sir, I don't think the computers know what's wrong. This woman, Ms. Vance, she looks like she does." There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. Then he heard muffled shouting, and the Major's voice, now directed away from the phone. "General, you need to hear this now." Inside the air-conditioned command center miles away, General Michelson, a man with 3 stars on his collar, took the phone from his aide. He listened for 10 seconds as Airman Peterson quickly relayed the scene. The general's face, already stern, hardened into something terrifying. "Major," he said, his voice a low growl. "Get me Colonel Hayes on the line. Conference him with the tower at Holloway now." He looked at his aide. "And get me a car. I'm going down there myself." He turned to the assembled staff. "For those of you who don't know," he said, "the woman my officer and lead technician are currently humiliating on that flight line is Alice Vance. They didn't call her a crew chief in Vietnam. They called her the Ghost because she could make dead birds fly again. The Patriot Bell isn't just a Huey. It was her Huey. Now, someone get me that car." Back on the sun-baked tarmac, the tension had reached its peak. Alice Vance had finished her call with the general. A brief exchange of quiet, respectful murmurs that the others couldn't hear. She handed the phone back to Peterson with a small, grateful nod. Then she turned back to the helicopter. Kramer, emboldened by the lack of any immediate lightning strike from the heavens, stepped in front of her. "Okay, you've had your phone call with your old war buddy. We're done here. The colonel wants this machine moved to a hangar." "I can get it started," Alice said simply. "Just let me open that panel." Lieutenant Wells had reached his limit. His authority was being challenged by a relic in front of his entire team. His career flashed before his eyes. "That's enough," Wells said, his voice dangerously loud. "Ms. Vance, you are a civilian interfering with a military operation on a secure installation. I am ordering you to leave the flight line immediately." Alice didn't move. She just held the lieutenant's gaze. "I mean it," Wells said, taking a step forward until he was invading Alice's personal space. He lowered his voice to a threatening hiss. "One more word, and I will have you escorted to the base stockade for a full security review. Do you understand me, old woman?" He placed his hand firmly on Alice's shoulder, intending to physically turn her and march her away. It was the final, irrevocable overreach, the ultimate act of arrogant folly. The sound that cut through the air wasn't the sputtering of an engine, but the high-pitched squeal of tires. A procession of 3 black command vehicles screeched to a halt on the tarmac just yards away, their doors flying open before they had fully stopped. From the lead vehicle emerged General Michelson himself, his face a mask of cold fury. Following him was the base commander, Colonel Hayes. The assembled technicians froze, their mouths agape. Lieutenant Wells snatched his hand back from Alice's shoulder as if he'd been burned. His blood ran cold. General Michelson didn't run. He moved with a speed and purpose that was far more terrifying. He strode across the concrete, his eyes locked on Alice Vance, ignoring everyone else as if they were nothing more than inanimate scenery. He bypassed the stunned lieutenant and the petrified lead technician, coming to a halt directly in front of the old woman in the faded jacket. In the ringing silence, General Michelson, a 3-star general in command of the entire region, brought his heels together with an audible crack. He raised his hand to his brow and delivered the sharpest, most respectful salute of his long and decorated career. "Ms. Vance," the general said, his voice booming across the tarmac, clear and strong for all to hear. "It is an honor to have you on my base, sir. I apologize for the reception you've received." Alice simply nodded, a flicker of sad understanding in her pale brown eyes. He did not seem surprised, or even particularly vindicated. He just seemed weary. The general dropped his salute, but remained at attention. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the dumbstruck crowd of technicians and falling with laser-like intensity on Lieutenant Wells and Kyle Kramer. "Let me make something perfectly clear to all of you," the general announced, his voice dropping to a lethally quiet register that nonetheless carried to every corner of the flight line. This woman whom you have treated with such profound disrespect is a living legend of Army aviation. This is Elias the Ghost Vance. She holds the Distinguished Service Cross for Valor, 2 silver stars, and a bronze star with a V device. She has more combat flight hours as a crew chief than every single pilot on this base combined. He pointed a rigid finger at the silent helicopter. That aircraft, the Patriot Bell, is not just a piece of equipment. It is a monument. In 1970, Ms. Vance personally redesigned the fuel flow regulators on this specific bird, a modification that is not and never will be in any of your manuals or your computers, a modification that allowed this Huey to fly higher and carry more weight than any other in the fleet, a modification that saved the lives of my entire platoon when she flew in to pull us off a hilltop we were about to be overrun on. I was a scared second lieutenant then, and she was the calmest person I have ever seen. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Jaws were slack. The technicians, who moments before had been snickering, now looked at Alice with a mixture of awe and deep, burning shame. Kramer looked as though he might be sick. Lieutenant Wells's face had gone from pale to ashen. The general turned his full attention back to Wells and Kramer. His voice was now barely a whisper, yet it was more terrifying than any shout. Your arrogance, your blind faith in your technology, and your utter lack of humility and respect have disgraced your uniforms and this command. You had the one woman on this planet who knows this aircraft's every secret standing right here offering her help. And you threatened her. You put your hand on her. General, a quiet voice interjected. It was Alice. She had stepped forward, placing a gentle, calming hand on the general's rigid forearm. They're good men, just from a different time. They trust their screens. It's not their fault. The bird just needs a familiar touch, that's all. Her grace was more cutting than any reprimand. She was defending the very men who had humiliated her. In that moment, she wasn't just a hero from the past. She was a teacher, offering a quiet lesson in wisdom and forgiveness. The general held his stare on Wells for a moment longer, then gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped back, ceding the stage. She's all yours, Ghost. Alice walked to the side of the Huey and finally unfastened the snap on her worn leather pouch. He didn't pull out a diagnostic tool or a complex meter. He retrieved a single, oddly shaped wrench. It was dark, forged from some unknown metal, and curved at an angle that matched no standard tool. As his fingers closed around it, the world flickered again. He was in a sweltering makeshift hangar at Khe-San, the air thick with the smell of canvas and hot metal. He was grinding this very piece of steel on a wet stone, shaping it by hand, checking its fit against a custom bolt he had machined himself. It was for her modification, the one no one else knew about, the key to the secret heart of the machine. The bolt controlled a manual bypass for the primary fuel injector, something she'd designed for emergencies, something no computer would ever know to look for. Back in the present, she reached for the small access panel that Kramer had dismissed. With the custom wrench, she turned the 4 bolts. They came loose with a smooth ease that no standard tool could have managed. She removed the plate, revealing a small, simple lever nestled within a tangle of wires. It was switched to the standard position. With the tip of the wrench, she gently nudged it to the bypass position. It clicked softly into place. She replaced the panel, tightening the bolts with a practiced touch. She then walked to the cockpit door and looked at the stunned technicians. "Someone want to try her now?" she asked, her voice calm. Kramer stumbled forward. He climbed into the pilot's seat, his hands shaking slightly. He went through the startup sequence, but this time, when he hit the ignition switch, the result was different. There was a cough, a sputter, and then with a thunderous roar that shook the very air, the turbine engine of the Patriot Bell screamed to life. The long, drooping rotor blades began to turn, faster and faster, until they were a shimmering, invisible disc, beating the air into submission with the familiar, life-affirming whump, whump, whump that was the heartbeat of a generation. The effect on the crowd was instantaneous. A spontaneous cheer erupted. Airman Peterson, the young man who had made the call, had tears in his eyes. The technicians were clapping, their earlier arrogance replaced by pure, unadulterated awe. Alice Vance simply stood back, a small, sad smile on her face, watching the bird she loved come back to life. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift but quiet. General Michelson didn't court-martial Lieutenant Wells or fire Kyle Kramer. Instead, he instituted a new mandatory training program for all maintenance personnel across his command, the Heritage Program. It focused on the history of their service branch's most iconic equipment, told through the stories of the men and women who flew, fought, and fixed them. The first module was about the UH-1 Huey, and its star was a grainy photograph of a young crew chief named Alice Vance. A week later, Kramer and a humbled Lieutenant Wells found Alice at a small roadside diner a few miles from the base. He was sitting in a booth by the window, nursing a cup of coffee. They hesitated at the door, then walked over, their hats in their hands. "Mr. Vance," Wells said, his voice barely a whisper. Alice looked up and nodded. "Lieutenant, Mr. Kramer." "Sir," Kramer began, his voice thick with emotion. We came to apologize. What we did, how we treated you, there's no excuse. We were arrogant and we were wrong. We are so sorry." Alice looked at their faces, at the genuine remorse in their eyes. She gestured to the empty seat in the booth. "Sit down," she said, her voice gentle. "Let me buy you boys a cup of coffee, and maybe if you've got the time, I'll tell you a story or two about that old bird." They sat, and as the afternoon sun streamed through the diner window, the old hero began to speak, bridging the gap between generations with stories of courage, ingenuity, and the quiet, unassuming valor of the forgotten.